In the lexicon of modern warfare, there exists a term that intelligence analysts whisper with genuine dread. It is not nuclear winter. It is not total war. It is something far more insidious. It is called synthetic zero. Synthetic zero is that precise moment when every sensor in your arsenal tells you that you are safe, while your reality is being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, without a single alarm, without a single warning, without mercy. On January 3, 2026, the Venezuelan regime was about to learn a lesson that will echo through military academies for the next 50 years. They were about to discover that in the age of the microchip, sovereignty cannot be purchased. It can only be manufactured. And if you do not control the silicon, you control nothing. Our story does not begin in Caracas. It begins 8 years earlier, in a city 7,000 miles away, in a place where wars are won before a single soldier ever leaves the barracks. This is the Shanghai Quantum Foundry, one of only 7 facilities on Earth capable of etching circuits at the 7 nanometer scale. In 2018, this facility was producing the QPX 7000 processors, the beating heart of China's most advanced export radar systems, the JY-27A, the so-called stealth killer. The JY-27A was Beijing's answer to American stealth technology, a very high-frequency radar operating in the VHF band, specifically designed to detect aircraft that were invisible to conventional X-band systems. On paper, it was brilliant. The physics were sound. Long wavelength radiation could bounce off stealth aircraft where shorter wavelengths would be absorbed. The radar had a detection range of 500 kilometers and could track up to 500 targets simultaneously. It was sold to 12 nations as the ultimate insurance policy against American air superiority. But Dr. Chen Wei had a problem, a gambling problem. $140,000 in debt to a Macau syndicate, and the NSA had noticed. The approach was surgical. No threats, no violence, just an envelope. Inside, photographs of his debt, photographs of his family, and a USB drive containing a firmware patch so small, so elegant, that it would fit inside a single redundant memory block of the QPX 7000 processor. The patch was 23 kilobytes, smaller than a photograph. It was designated Shadow Link Protocol, and it would sleep, dormant and invisible, for 8 years, waiting, listening, until the moment it was activated by a specific harmonic frequency, a digital tuning fork that only the United States Navy possessed. On November 14, 2018, Dr. Chen Wei uploaded the patch into build batch QX-7721, 3,000 processors, enough to supply radar systems to Venezuela, Iran, and Syria. The NSA paid him nothing. They simply erased his debt, and then they erased him from their files. Dr. Chen Wei is alive today. He works as a quality control inspector at a battery factory in Chongqing. He believes he made a deal with criminals. He has no idea he inserted a time bomb into the nervous system of a dozen nations. The hardware vulnerability was perfect, undetectable, a ghost in the machine. Shadowlink exploited what engineers call dark silicon, transistor gates that remain inactive under normal operation. Modern processors contain billions of transistors, but only a fraction are active at any given time. The rest sit dormant, waiting for instructions that never come. These dark zones are the perfect hiding place. Under the precise resonance frequency of 4.7 gigahertz, pulsed in a specific binary pattern, a sequence of ones and zeros that mimicked natural electromagnetic interference, these gates would awaken. And when they did, they would do something unprecedented in the history of electronic warfare. They would lie. The Shadowlink protocol didn't just corrupt data, it was far more sophisticated than that. It created what intelligence analysts call a synthetic reality layer. The radar would continue to function normally. It would scan the sky. It would detect aircraft. But before that data reached the operator's screens, it would pass through a filter. An artificial intelligence trained on 8 years of Venezuelan airspace data. This AI would decide what was real and what was a threat, and it would show the operators only what the algorithm wanted them to see. The Venezuelans called it El Anillo de Hierro, the Iron Ring. $14 billion of Russian and Chinese hardware, the regime's final insurance policy. A fortress designed to survive a nuclear first strike. Inside, the pride of the regime, S-300VM air defense batteries from Moscow, JY-27A wideband surveillance radars from Beijing, EW-5000 electronic warfare suites, encrypted fiber optic networks, biometric security, thermal imaging. This was supposed to be impenetrable. The bunker itself was an engineering marvel. 30 meters of reinforced concrete, rebar-strengthened walls, capable of withstanding a direct hit from a bunker-buster bomb. The air filtration system could sustain 300 personnel for 6 months in a nuclear fallout scenario. Redundant power systems, independent water supply, emergency escape tunnels that stretched 2 kilometers beneath the mountains. On paper, it was perfect. General Rafael Castillo had spent his entire career preparing for this bunker to be tested. A veteran of 42 years, trained in Moscow during the Cold War, he had studied every American military operation since Desert Storm. He had watched the precision strikes in Baghdad, the shock and awe of 2003, the surgical decapitation of Saddam's command structure. He believed he understood the American way of war. He believed in overwhelming force, in shock and awe, in the thunder of Tomahawk missiles screaming across the night sky. The general sipped his Cuban coffee, reviewing tactical maps with his advisors. The coffee was strong, bitter, imported directly from Havana as a gift from his counterparts in Cuban intelligence. It was 1:30 a.m., and he was on his second shift of the night, standard protocol during heightened alert periods. "The gringos are loud," he said, setting down his cup. "They are always loud. They announce themselves with carriers and strike groups. We will hear them coming from 100 miles away." His Cuban advisor, Major Luis Ochoa, nodded in agreement. Ochoa was a veteran of Angola, a man who had spent 30 years studying American tactics. "Our systems are integrated, General. Triple redundancy. If one radar fails, 2 more are watching." The S-300 batteries are positioned in overlapping fields of fire. They cannot deceive us. The general smiled. He gestured to the main display screen, where a 3D representation of Venezuelan airspace glowed in soft blues and greens. Every aircraft, every ship, every potential threat vector was mapped in real time. "Look at this," he said with pride. "We can see a sparrow at 200 kilometers. How could they possibly hide an entire strike force?" He did not know that at this exact moment, 1,200 kilometers to the north, a U.S. Navy EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft had just transmitted a 30-millisecond pulse toward Caracas. The pulse was invisible, undetectable by conventional means. It was a knock on a door that had been built 8 years ago in Shanghai. At 22:47 hours, the activation sequence was transmitted. Shadowlink awoke, and the war had already been lost. The radar systems did not shut down. That would have triggered alarms. Instead, they entered a state that NSA engineers called synthetic mirroring. The radars were still scanning, still transmitting, still receiving, but now the data was being filtered through an AI layer that had one job: to show the operators exactly what they expected to see. A calm sky, An empty night. Peace. The transition was seamless. Not a single officer in the Iron Ring noticed the change. The radar pulses continued at their normal repetition rate of 300 Hz. The signal processing continued to analyze returns. The difference was invisible. The machine had been taught to hallucinate, and it was performing flawlessly. These are not helicopters. They are whispers. Officially, they do not exist. Internally, they are designated MH-X, Wraith. The operators call them Ghost Hawks, the evolutionary descendants of the stealth Black Hawks used to kill Osama bin Laden. But these are a different species entirely. The Ghost Hawk represents 15 years of evolution beyond the helicopter that crashed in Abbottabad, where that aircraft used basic acoustic dampening and angular surfaces to reduce its radar signature. The Ghost Hawk is a complete reimagining of rotary wing stealth technology. The rotor blades are manufactured from a carbon composite matrix embedded with acoustic metamaterials, engineered structures that bend sound waves around the aircraft rather than simply absorbing them. The fuselage is coated in radar-absorbent material that is effective across 9 different frequency bands. Even the exhaust is cooled and diffused through a series of baffles that reduce the infrared signature to nearly zero. But the most revolutionary technology is something called active noise cancellation at the macro scale. The helicopter doesn't just try to be quiet. It listens to its own sound signature and generates counterwaves that destructively interfere with the noise it produces. The result is an aircraft that, at a distance of more than 200 meters, is quieter than ambient city noise. The mission profile was suicidal by conventional standards. The flight path took them through the Avila mountain passes, a gauntlet of jagged peaks and unpredictable wind shear, at an altitude of 15 meters, 50 feet, low enough that a single mistake, a single gust of wind, would turn a $100 million aircraft into a fireball against the mountainside. The pilots flew using only the heads-up display. Outside the canopy was complete darkness. They were flying blind, trusting the machine. The HUD showed a synthetic wireframe representation of the terrain, generated in real time by forward-looking LiDAR and millimeter-wave radar. The system updated 50 times per second, building a 3D map of the world that existed only in the computer's memory. "Entering the valley," the pilot reported, his voice calm despite the fact that he was threading a 50-foot aircraft through a mountain pass at 120 knots. "Terrain masking active. We are 17 meters above ground level. End shear from the northeast at 20 knots. The co-pilot's hands hovered over the collective and cyclic controls, ready to take over if the autopilot failed. But the autopilot was not going to fail. It had been tested in simulation 10,000 times. Every possible wind pattern, every possible failure mode had been accounted for. The machine knew this valley better than any human pilot ever could. The technology keeping them alive was called phase cancellation. The Ghost Hawk's rotors were designed to produce overlapping sound waves that interfered destructively, canceling each other out. To a radar, they had the cross-section of a sparrow. To the human ear, they were a distant hum that could be mistaken for a generator. To thermal sensors, they were invisible, their heat signature masked by active cooling systems and carefully managed exhaust dispersion. But the real magic was in what the JY-27A radars were not seeing. In Caracas, 23 kilometers to the south, the radar operators were staring at screens that showed an empty sky. The Shadowlink protocol was feeding them a digital hallucination, a synthetic echo of the previous 6 hours of airspace data, looped seamlessly. They were watching a movie, a perfect AI-generated forgery of reality. In the Iron Ring bunker, the radar operator yawned. He checked his watch. 3:44 a.m. Everything was green. Everything was quiet. "All sectors clear. he reported to his supervisor. No activity. Sector 7 shows normal commercial traffic at flight level 350. Sector 3 has light atmospheric scatter, probably a weather front moving in from the coast. Nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the Ghost Hawks were 8 kilometers away and closing at 180 kilometers per hour. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. The pilot's breathing was controlled but rapid. His heart rate, monitored by the suit's biometric sensors, had climbed to 110 beats per minute. This was the most dangerous phase of the mission. One moment of inattention, one miscalculation, and they would become a crater on the mountainside. "Pico Naiguata, dead ahead," the co-pilot warned, his voice tight. "Wind shear warning. Cross-draft at 32 knots. Recommend reducing speed." Pico Naiguata, the highest peak in the Avila Range, a 2,700-meter wall of rock that generated treacherous microbursts of wind, mountain waves that could flip an aircraft inverted in seconds. At this altitude, with zero margin for error, it was a knife's edge between success and catastrophic failure. The Ghost Hawk banked hard left, its rotor blades mere meters from the cliff face. Small rocks, dislodged by the rotor wash, tumbled down the mountainside. "Correcting," the pilot said tersely, his hands making minute adjustments to the controls. "We're clean. Approaching target zone in 90 seconds. The operators inside these Ghost Hawks were not conventional pilots. They were test pilots. Former members of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, with over 4,000 hours in night operations. Men who had learned to trust the machine more than their own instincts. Because in this environment, at this altitude, in this darkness, instinct would get you killed. Only the algorithm could see the path forward. "Thermal analysis complete," the co-pilot reported, his eyes scanning the tactical display. 16 hostiles on perimeter, 4 stationary at guard posts, 12 mobile on patrol routes. Recommend ingress vector Charlie. It gives us the best approach angle and puts us in the thermal shadow of the ventilation tower. Charlie confirmed. "Delta team, you are go for insertion." The Ghost Hawks flared into a hover above a ventilation shaft. The rotor wash kicked up debris, but the sound was minimal. To anyone on the ground, it would sound like a distant generator struggling under load. Ropes dropped from the side doors. Shadows descended in perfect silence. 8 operators per helicopter. 48 men in total. The assault force fast roped down in 8 seconds. The extraction zone was a flat roof less than 40 meters from the bunker's primary air intake. The Delta Force operators fast roped down in 8 seconds. By the time their boots touched concrete, the helicopters were already climbing back into the thermal shadow of the mountains. Invisible. Untraceable. Ghosts. The Venezuelan armed forces were what Pentagon analysts called a museum army. Soldiers trained on Cold War doctrine, weapons purchased from catalogs of yesterday's wars. They were looking for tanks, for paratroopers, for the loud, crushing weight of American armor rolling across open terrain. Their training manuals were Soviet-era documents, translated into Spanish but never updated for modern warfare. They practiced defending against massed armor assaults, against waves of paratroopers dropping from the sky, against conventional artillery bombardments. They were mentally prepared for Kursk, for the Fulda Gap, for Desert Storm. They were not prepared for an enemy that moved through the cracks of their own technology, an enemy that had already bypassed their walls without cutting a single wire. The security system was a Chinese-made integration of facial recognition, thermal imaging, and motion detection. The ZK-9000 Smart Fortress system, manufactured by Zhejiang Quantum Security Limited. On paper, it was flawless, capable of tracking 300 individual targets simultaneously, facial recognition accurate to 99.7%, thermal imaging, sensitive enough to detect a human being through 8 inches of concrete. In practice, it had been compromised before the first camera was even installed. Because the firmware, manufactured in Shenzhen, had its own ShadowLink variant embedded at the kernel level, the guards were watching a 3-second delay. In their world, the hallway was empty. In reality, it had already been breached. 3 seconds. An eternity in combat time. The difference between a locked door and a ghost already inside your house. The Delta operators moved like water through the corridors. Hand signals, suppressed weapons, breaching charges placed with surgical precision on door hinges. Every movement was calculated. Every step was silent. These were men who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of invisible warfare. The biometric scanners turned green, not because they were hacked, but because the ShadowLink protocol whispered to the central security brain that these men, these intruders, belonged there. The machine believed the lie, and so the doors simply opened. A Venezuelan guard rounded a corner, saw nothing on his thermal scope. The screen showed an empty corridor, ambient temperature 22 degrees Celsius. He continued walking, his AK-103 slung casually over his shoulder. He was 3 meters from a Delta operator pressed against the wall, holding his breath, watching the guard through night vision goggles. The thermal camera showed only empty space. The guard passed within arm's reach and never knew he was already dead if the mission required it. This was cognitive saturation. The human brain cannot process a threat that the machine insists does not exist. By the time the first visual confirmation was made, by human eyes, not cameras, the tactical advantage was absolute. General Castillo was on his 3rd cup of coffee. The bitter liquid had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. Major Ochoa sat across from him, reviewing encrypted communications on a hardened tablet. The bunker had a peculiar smell, recycled air mixed with ozone from the electronic equipment and the faint aroma of Cuban tobacco that Ochoa smoked, despite regulations. "Any unusual activity?" the general asked, relaxed, almost bored. This was the 5th night of heightened alert status. 5 nights of nothing. His men were getting tired, complacent. "None, General. All systems nominal. The Americans are quiet tonight." Ochoa scrolled through the intelligence reports. "Southcom has 3 ships in the Caribbean, but they're conducting standard patrols. No unusual air activity, no satellite repositioning. Everything is normal." General Castillo smiled. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "You see? All this panic for nothing. The Americans make noise before they strike. They leak to the press. They move carrier groups. They are predictable." He did not know that his encrypted phone, a Huawei P60 Pro, manufactured in Shenzhen, firmware signed in Shanghai, was currently broadcasting every word to a relay station in Curaçao. The phone's secure enclave, the isolated chip that was supposed to protect encryption keys, had been compromised at the foundry level. Every message, every call, every piece of data that passed through that phone was being copied in real time and transmitted via a covert channel hidden in the 5G protocol stack. At 4:01 a.m., General Castillo's phone rang. The ringtone was a simple military buzzer. He picked it up, expecting a routine status report. Instead, he heard panic. It was his air defense commander at Fuerte Tiuna, 15 kilometers south. The voice on the line was frantic, breathless. "General, we have reports, unconfirmed, of helicopter sounds near the palace. Multiple sources, civilians calling in. They say they hear helicopters, but we see nothing on radar." General Castillo frowned. He looked at his radar display on the main screen. Green, empty, peaceful. 500 kilometers of airspace, all clear. "Impossible," he said, his voice sharp. "Our radars show nothing." You were hearing ghosts, Commander. Probably civilian helicopters on a medical evacuation. Check with air traffic control. Sir, we did check. There are no authorized flights in that sector. The civilians are insistent. Some are saying they can feel the vibration in their windows. But the voice on the other end was insistent, panicked. The general's confidence began to crack. He stood, walked to the operations center. The screen still showed a clear sky, but now there was a voice in his head, a whisper of doubt. The voice that every commander fears, the voice that asks, "What if I'm wrong?" He grabbed a handheld radio, tried to contact the palace perimeter guards. Static, white noise, a high-pitched whine that made him wince. "Communications!" he shouted across the bunker. "Why am I hearing static?" The communications officer, a young lieutenant who had been trained in Havana, looked confused. His fingers flew across his console. "Sir, all encrypted channels are experiencing interference. Heavy interference. We're trying to isolate the source, but it's everywhere. It's like someone is jamming every frequency simultaneously. Then switch to backup frequencies." "Sir, we are on backup frequencies. They're all compromised." Suddenly, the lights flickered. Just for a second. The bunker's independent power system stuttered. The screens went dark, then came back online. Long enough to make everyone freeze. Long enough to feel fear creep into the room. This was the echo chamber effect. Every encrypted channel was being flooded with recorded loops of previous conversations. Orders that had been given hours ago, now repeated out of context. Views of commanders giving contradictory instructions. The officers were arguing with recordings of themselves. The command structure was eating itself alive. General Castillo stood in the center of the operations room, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool, recycled air. Around him, his staff were shouting into dead radios, typing frantically on keyboards that produced no response, staring at screens that showed them lies. For the first time in 42 years of military service, General Rafael Castillo felt true fear. Chaos erupted in the Iron Ring Command Center. Officers were shouting. Radios crackled with contradictory orders. General Castillo stood in the center, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Shut down the radars!" he shouted. "Reboot everything, now!" But it was already too late. The Shadow Link protocol had anticipated this response. When the radars powered down for reboot, the dormant firmware activated fully, and when the systems came back online 30 seconds later, they were no longer Venezuelan. They were orphaned, masterless. They belonged to the ghost in the machine. The main screen flickered. Instead of radar data, it displayed a simple message in English, white text on black background. System compromised. Major Ochoa stared at the screen, his face drained of color. His hands trembled. The cigarette he had been holding fell from his fingers. "Dios mío," he whispered. "They're already inside." The Delta operators reached the bunker's inner sanctum. The final door was reinforced steel, 6 inches thick, with triple locking bolts. A breaching charge would bring the entire complex down on their heads. The overpressure in these confined spaces would kill everyone, attackers and defenders alike. Instead, the lead operator placed a small electromagnetic device against the locking mechanism. It was a black box, about the size of a deck of cards, with a single red LED that pulsed slowly. The device interfaced directly with the door's electronic lock, and through it, with the Shadow Link protocol running in the bunker's central security computer. The protocol sent a single command: unlock. The bolts retracted with a hydraulic hiss. The massive door swung open on silent hinges, revealing the command center beyond. Inside, they found a command structure that had already surrendered to a reality it could not comprehend. General Castillo stood at his desk, staring at a dead phone. His sidearm, a gold-plated Makarov pistol, a gift from Havana, engraved with his name, sat untouched in its holster. There was no fight left in him. He looked up at the black-clad figures entering his sanctum and saw not soldiers, but ghosts, phantoms that had walked through walls. "How?" the general asked in English, his voice defeated, hollow. "How did you?" The Delta operator did not answer. There was nothing to say. High tensile zip ties clicked into place around the general's wrists. The plastic bit into his skin. He was led away without resistance. A man who had spent his entire life preparing for war, defeated without firing a shot. There was no last stand, no heroic final speech, no dramatic sacrifice. Just the mechanical sound of restraints and the cold, clinical efficiency of men who had already won the war before they ever stepped off the helicopter. The other officers were secured in rapid succession. 23 high-value targets. Colonels, generals, intelligence officers, the entire command structure of the Venezuelan military. Each one was processed with the same cold efficiency. Identification verified, restraints applied, moved to the extraction point. The data extraction took 4 minutes. Terabytes of encrypted communications, battle plans, financial records, lists of agents, bank accounts. Every secret the regime had buried in silicon was now being copied to hardened military-grade SSDs. Every piece of information that could be used to dismantle what remained of the regime's power structure. When the extraction was complete, the Delta operators placed small thermite charges on the server racks. Not to destroy them, the data was already copied, but to ensure that no one else could access what remained. The charges would burn at 3,000 degrees, turning the drives into slag. Above ground, the city of Caracas remained asleep. The local police monitored their own outdated radar systems. They saw nothing unusual. To them, the night was quiet. The police dispatcher was fielding calls about helicopter noises, but she dismissed them. Probably a medical evacuation, she thought. Nothing to worry about. The surface-level military units were still being fed synthetic zero data. They had no idea their supreme command had been decapitated. This is the horror of modern warfare. You can lose your nation while your guards are finishing their coffee, utterly convinced that everything is under control. At 4:47 a.m., the Ghost Hawks returned. The extraction was flawless. Ropes dropped from the darkness. Operators ascended with their prisoners. The high-value targets were strapped into transport harnesses, their heads covered with blackout hoods. Within 6 minutes, the helicopters were airborne, banking back toward the mountains. "Package secured," the pilot reported, his voice steady. "Egressing via Route Whiskey. ETA to friendly waters, 42 minutes. Confirmed, we are clear and dark." The Ghost Hawks disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, flying the same impossible route through the mountains. Behind them, the Iron Ring bunker sat silent. Lights still on, radar systems still spinning, climate control humming. But the brain was gone. It was a corpse that didn't yet know it was dead. In the aftermath, the forensic analysis of Operation Iron Ring sent shockwaves through every defense ministry on Earth. Every nation that had purchased hardware from the digital Silk Road, from Beijing, from Moscow, was forced to confront a terrifying truth. Their billion-dollar arsenals were not shields. They were liabilities. Trojan horses waiting to be activated. The Shadowlink protocol had proven what intelligence agencies had warned for decades. In the era of integrated firmware, you are only as sovereign as the chips in your server room. Within 72 hours of the operation, emergency meetings were convened in Tehran, Damascus, Pyongyang, and a dozen other capitals. Military attachés were recalled. Contracts were frozen. Entire radar networks were taken offline for inspection. But the inspections revealed nothing. The vulnerability was invisible, hidden in the dark silicon, waiting. Dr. Chen Wei still does not know what he did, and he never will. The NSA's ledger has been balanced, the debt erased. The ghost is the machine. He sits in his small apartment in Chongqing, watching state television broadcast news of a mysterious technical failure in Venezuela. He has no idea that he is watching the result of his own work. No idea that his 23 kilobytes of code reshaped the future of warfare. He changes the channel and eats his dinner alone. The Caracas bunker stands today as a monument to technical hubris. $14 billion. 30 meters of reinforced concrete. The finest hardware that foreign money could buy. It failed at the only job it had. Not because it was weak, but because it was never truly theirs. The lesson of January 3rd, 2026 will be studied for the next 50 years. Sovereignty in the 21st century cannot be rented. It cannot be purchased in a box from Shanghai or Moscow. If you do not manufacture your own chips, you do not own your defense. You are simply a tenant in a fortress whose master key has always belonged to someone else. The United States learned this lesson decades ago. That is why American defense contractors are forbidden from using foreign-manufactured processors in classified systems. That is why the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency invests billions in domestic semiconductor production. That is why every critical chip is audited, X-rayed, and tested for hardware backdoors. But for the nations of the digital Silk Road, this lesson came too late. Their radars still spin. Their missiles still sit in their silos. Their command bunkers still glow with screens and lights. But they will never know if they are truly seeing reality or just another synthetic hallucination, another movie playing while their enemies walk unseen through their halls. Shadow Link Protocol, still active. Estimated affected systems, classified. The war you cannot see has already begun.